Welcome everyone to another session of TriTech University. My name is Bill Steppen, and today we are going to continue on our, I guess we'll call it our Quaranteminar series, in just looking at all the different ways in which you can try and squeeze the most out of your AIM software, so that way we can try and help you maximize this not only for the long term, but also during this kind of weird short term, hopefully, situation that we're all in. Today's focus is going to be all about looking at different little tips and tricks that I've picked up over the years regarding vendors. This was a suggested webinar by one of our long-term clients. So hopefully you are in attendance today. And if not, obviously all of these sessions are recorded. So the big thing here is going to be if you've got any questions, definitely more so than any other webinar today. I would like to hear your questions. So I will be monitoring those questions coming in from the attendees today, and it looks like our topic picture is in attendance today. So good morning. Glad to see that you're here. All right. If you've never attended one of these webinars before, you're going to see that GoToWebinar control panel kind of off to the side. That is where you can relay those questions to me. So you're going to see a questions panel in there. Definitely key in any questions that you have throughout today's webinar. I will be monitoring those and answering those as best as I can. That being said, if that toolbar is taking up too much space on your screen, if you've got a small screen and you're having a hard time seeing what I'm covering today, definitely let me, well, don't let me know, but you can click on a little button. There's going to be a little button on that toolbar. It looks like a little orange button with a white arrow on it. By clicking on that, that will compress that webinar menu off to the side, and you can then see the rest of my screen. And of course, you can click on that button at any time to bring it back up. All right, let's go ahead and jump into my little laundry list of things that we wanted to talk about today. Now, these things have been around for versions and versions. Some of these things are kind of specific to version 12. So if you are still on version 11, I'll let you know where things are kind of unique to version 12 in that respect. Let's go ahead and take a look at a few things. Now, right off the hopper, something that is brand new to version 12 are something known as vendor defaults. We're going to find these in the maintenance menu of accounts payable. And here in accounts payable, we will see the vendor default option. A vendor default is basically a way to quickly make sure that corresponding common expenses for AP invoices are selected for these vendors as you're building them into your system. Now, I have a couple in here that I have by default. If you've installed version 12 brand new, you very much more than likely have these as well. If you've converted over from version 11, you may need to create these. But the idea here is that one of the first questions that you'll be asked of when creating a new vendor is, what is its default? I've got two here by example. I'm going to add a third one here. Notice I've got inventory and utilities. Now, the idea here is that when you key in an AP invoice, you need to expense that invoice to general ledger. And more often than not, these expenses are pretty commonplace from one vendor to another. So in the case of an inventory vendor, you are buying product from that vendor. More than likely, you're expensing the cost of that product when it's been received and any shipping charges. So just to quickly see what I've got here, I'm going to go ahead and show just the vendors, just the ledgers that I have here. And it looks like I actually forgot to check mark those here this morning. So the common ones that you'll be check marking, let me go ahead and just sort by ledger account here, are 20198 for your inventory received pending invoice. So I'm going to check mark that one. And then for any shipping charges, that would then be 415-1 by default. Now, I'm going to go ahead and throw out my common disclaimer here for anything relating to general ledger. I am by no means an accountant, and no one really at TriTech is that's on the technical support staff or the sales staff or anything like that. These are the common, or I should say the default ledgers that we have in our chart of accounts. Yours may certainly be different if you've made any modifications to it, or if you've come all the way through from prior versions and the DOS and earlier versions of Windows. There may be tweaks to that that we've made over the years that could be different from this. I know right off the bat, for example, 201.98 used to be 120.98 if you are coming all the way for DOS days back in the 80s and early 90s. So just kind of bear that in mind. Your ledgers may be different than mine. The best resource as far as which ledgers should be impacted would be your bookkeeper or CPA. But that's kind of the idea here, is basically when I am setting up vendors for inventory, those are usually the most common expenses that I might have. When it comes to utility vendors, so vendors that I buy utilities from, the common one that I might be expensing for that would be any number of utility expenses in my general ledger. So basically the idea with this is that when I go to create a new vendor, if I go into modules and accounts payable and add or change vendor, and I'm going to go ahead and click the add button here, the first question it's going to ask me then is, what vendor default from this packed list should I be using? So if I go ahead and select inventory, then when I'm setting up my vendor, let's say it's Acme Supply Company, basically when I save all that, and of course it needs a short name, so let's go ahead and put Acme in there. We'll be coming back to this screen in just a moment, but basically the idea with that then is that when I go to put in an AP invoice for that vendor, let's go ahead and select Acme, and I get to the expense tab. The options for expensing that ledger that came from that vendor default will be right here at the top of this listing in bold. So you can see, because I specified this was an inventory default, and from the inventory default, I had selected those two ledgers. Let me go ahead and focus on that again here. That focus option does not seem to be working here. Oh, okay, that's right, because I'm sorting by utilities. There we go. That'll be better. So you can see how it's got those two ledger accounts checkmarked here for inventory vendors, and by extension, those would be the top two on this list, just to easily find them. Obviously, the rest of all of those ledger accounts are showing up on that ledger listing, so you could go ahead and select any of them from that list should you need to do a one-off expense on a different ledger account. Jennifer is asking, so are you saying you have to have the 415-1 checked, or when checking inventory prices, they won't include the shipping? Not so, Jennifer. Really, this is all about this expensing of AP invoices. Really, when you're checking inventory prices, the shipping is really just in regards to the freight field on those inventory records. So they're kind of mutually exclusive in that respect. They're really meant to kind of keep it. They don't really talk to each other, for lack of a better term, but they are there to handle both an actual ledger utility as well as the freight function, which we can talk about in webinars kind of more specific related to inventory. But suffice to say, you've got a cost and a freight field on your inventory records, and then those two fields combined automatically flow into what's called a weighted cost field. So then when you're running your reports, you can choose to either run them for cost or for weighted cost. So hopefully that makes sense in that respect. We're going to be looking a little bit more at some other functions here relating to AP invoices later on in this webinar. But thank you so much for the question there, Jennifer. All right. So hopefully that makes sense regarding vendor defaults. We're not doing a whole lot with them really at this point. Basically, the main thing there is just specifying an easy way to make sure that you've got your ledger accounts easily selectable there. I mentioned I was going to add another one here. Let's say, for example, maybe you deal with a lot of financing companies, so crediting agencies and so forth. Maybe you'd like to create a vendor default so that you can very easily have their appropriate ledgers as well. So we'll go ahead and we'll add another one here as an example. I'm going to go ahead and call this financial vendors. I'm going to go ahead and save that description here. And then what I'm going to do is now with the ability to go in and select what are the appropriate or most common ledger expenses, I'm just going to go down and find a professional services ledger account that I happen to know exists in here. You may certainly have other types of ledger accounts for expenses such as banking fees and finance charges and all these other things. Since this is the one I have, this is the one I'm going with, then by extension, when I am putting in a quote unquote financial vendor, I can select the financial default and professional services will automatically be checkmarked for the common ledger expenses for that vendor. If you would like to tweak that on the fly for any given vendor, you certainly can do so. Let's go ahead and take a look at how to actually set up a vendor and get the most out of that. We're going to go into modules and accounts payable and add change vendor. And in this add change vendor list, if you have existing vendors, of course, it will come up and ask you which one you'd like to select. Let's go ahead and add one from scratch here. So when I click add, as we just discussed, the first thing it's going to ask me is what is the vendor default that I want to use for that. So let's go ahead and select that financial vendor. It'll automatically come up with a vendor number for me. One of the biggest questions I ask is what's the purpose of this vendor number? And honestly, it's really just there for the computer to have a way to easily reference the same vendor over and over. So for example, you may come back later on and you may change the name of the vendor if the company has changed its if the company has actually changed its name. You can come in and change the name here, but still retain the same vendor number. And basically that vendor number is always going to be a constant for all of the history. All of the inventory attached to this vendor gets attached by way of that number, so that way you can technically change other details. You don't have to worry about disconnecting these other records that come into contact with this vendor. Some other functions here. So there's a lot of fields on here, obviously. But mostly the ones that you really need from a basic standpoint are the names. So again, I put in the Acme Supply Company. Let's say this is the Acme Finances. And of course, addresses, phone numbers, things like that. Basically, as you fill these in, they'll become available for you to have on record for that vendor. One little pro tip I will mention, you may have noticed as I was tabbing through these fields, it skipped past city and state. And you may have also noticed this if you are constantly keying in new customers from scratch as you're using the tab key to move from one field to another. This is by design. What it will do is if you put in a commonly used zip code that you've keyed in the past, it will come back with the city and the state and the country and all those details for that particular zip code. If, however, you get to that vendor field, so I'm going to go ahead and tab back through this. I'm going to key in a zip code that I know doesn't exist. And you'll notice when I tab next, it's going to go back and ask for the city and the state. So in this case, let's go ahead and put that in. And then as I move forward now, anytime I key in that zip code, it will remember that city and state and country combination. The only other things that you really absolutely need for a vendor is what's called a short name. And that can be anything you want it to be. Typically, in prior versions, this would be the first thing you would see and could search by. Nowadays, of course, in version 12, you can very easily search by the full name or by other details. But basically, it's a way to have a quick lookup for a given vendor account. Now, some things that you may not be taking advantage of here in the case of setting up vendors. Let's go ahead and take a look at the Details tab. On this Details tab, it's going to ask you if you've got some extra detail that you'd like to add for this vendor. If you have a specific account number with the vendor that you would like to have show up on payments to the vendor when you're printing out checks, on purchase orders that you're printing out to submit to the vendor, go ahead and put that account number up here in that account field. And then that way that will show up automatically on those kind of correspondences to the vendor. That way they have a better way of looking you up other than by simply your name. Other things in here, you're probably making use of common terms, credit limits, and things like that already. There is another function here called minimum and free order and shipping amounts. And again, this is something that I've kind of seen hit or miss throughout my time working with clients. If you need to reach a specific minimum order amount in order to even submit an order to this vendor, and obviously a financial vendor like this probably wouldn't apply, but if you did need to have that, you could put that in there. So let's say I need to have a minimum cost of $200 in order to order anything from this vendor. I can put that into that minimum order field. By extension, if I qualify for some kind of free shipping, again, if this were an inventory vendor, I can put that in the free shipping amount field. Let's say if I need to have a minimum of 200, but I order at least 500, then I get free shipping. You can have those in there, and what that will then do is that will show up when you are generating purchase orders for these vendors. So when you go to create purchase orders, there will be a little spot top of the screen that will say, for this vendor, there's a free shipping amount and a minimum order amount. And that way you can see that information right as you're building these, so that if needed, you could go back and you could order additional product just to make sure that you are reaching those plateaus. Katie is asking, if you put in terms for something, can you change those terms when you invoice so you have a default terms that you can still change if for some reason they are different? And definitely, Katie. These are basically all defaults for this vendor, but at any point you can definitely change them, especially in the case of the terms. Honestly, not so much for things like credit limits or minimum order amounts, but definitely in the case of the terms, this would be a default term that you could have for all of your vendors. Now, in regards to paying these vendors, there's a couple of ways of paying them, and I will be focusing on doing specifically a webinar upcoming here on paying vendors with credit cards, both in the prepay and a post-pay fashion. But we do have these fields here for banking information. And if you have your vendors' banking information for doing direct deposit payments, so to speak, or ACH payments into their system, you can go ahead and you can plug those details into here. Their routing information, their account information, their type of account that is, and we'll be looking at this a little bit later, but when you go to do a check run for this vendor, you have the option of doing what's called developing or creating what's called a NACHA file. NACHA is a specific formatted file for use with doing ACH transactions. And if you're using ACH Treasury, or if you have software directly from your bank for doing ACH transactions, basically that's something that you could then have those checks essentially be electronically withdrawn from your account rather than having to physically print them and mail them. So in order to do that, you would want to make sure that you have your vendor's bank account information in there so that it knows where to actually send that money if you're doing an ACH transfer. I will be doing another webinar also on discounting functions, how to take advantage of AP discounts. So I'm going to save that for next week when I do that webinar, but just know that this is basically where you can come in and set your common automatic discounts for early payment with any given vendor. If there is any kind of website that you want to have on file for the vendor, you can put that here in the web field. And if you need to have some kind of tax ID on file for the vendor, you can plug that into the tax ID field. If this needs to be easily sorted for 1099 purposes at the end of your year, you can check mark them as 1099 reportable, and that will in turn translate when you are running your AP check register. You can run this specifically for 1099 reportable vendors, and then that way you'll see the totals that you have paid out to these vendors for that whatever date range you run it for, typically for a calendar year. Stephanie is asking, does vendor bank info get masked for security? I believe that that can be masked as part of our security functions here. So let's take a quick look at that while we have you here, Stephanie. We're going to go into employee groups and let's just take a peek here. So if we look in the permissions, and what I'm going to do is look for, let's say, routing, ACH, ability to add, view AP file attachments, add view. Let's just make that a little bit bigger. See if I can make that bigger so I can see what those fields are actually saying. Apparently not, but got the function keys for that. Ability to add, view service file attachments, vendor file attachments, delete attachments, the ACH export function itself. I'm not seeing if that is masked or has a masking function. Typically, if you're concerned about people seeing that information, then ideally what you'd probably want to do, Stephanie, is just make sure that people of a given group wouldn't have the access to come in to these fields to begin with, or to these programs such as add change vendors. So that may be something you would want to go in and actually just secure out. For some reason, I can't click back into that contains box. There we go. So you could secure out the ability to get into add change vendor to begin with. So by coming in here and then taking away the, let's see if we can actually find ability to add, there we go, add or slash change vendor. So by coming in here and removing, for example, salespeople's access to seeing that information to begin with, going in and accessing that, you can make sure that they're not going to be able to see those fields. Typically, people who are going to be needing that information would need to see that information should they want to verify it. But if you would like to check in with our development team, or rather our support staff, you can always make a request through there to see if there would be a way of securing that specifically so that only people of a certain security clearance can see that information. Obviously, we do have that for customer accounts, so you can make sure that that type of information is securable and hideable, if that makes sense. And that extends to for things like social security numbers and other sensitive details on customer accounts. But thank you so much there, Stephanie, for the question. So yeah, bank account information for doing NACHA payments and ACH payments. I also want to talk a little bit about this exchange rate function here. If you are either an international client of ours that purchases from U.S. vendors, or the opposite, if you are, excuse me, a U.S. vendor that happens to buy from international vendors, such as from overseas or what have you, you can checkmark them to require an exchange rate. With that checkmarked, you can then go in, and as you are receiving purchase orders from those vendors, one of the things that you'd be able to do is you'd be able to right-click on a purchase order and get the exchange rate from that particular vendor's country of origin, so that that way, when it comes in, what we're technically doing is we're seeing the cost values as they would exist from within your local currency. We can convert them to be as of the U.S. currency, or vice versa, depending on which way you need that to go back and forth through. So that's another function that you can take advantage of. Getting those exchange rates would require part of our active e-services. So if you're interested in that, definitely give our sales team a call, and we can let you know what the subscription fee would be for that part of our active e-service. Just a few other things here in regards to the vendors themselves. On this ledger tab, another thing that you may find very handy and not be doing here is the ability to specify which accounts payable ledger number the ledger activity or the open balances for a given vendor is being dumped into. The 201-1 accounts payable ledger account is the default one for all of your vendors, but if you would like to separate out basically which ledger account is holding that AP liability, you can do that per vendor by coming in here and selecting different ledger accounts for the accounts payable ledger number. We have one other option in here by default, the 201-5 flooring payable for any flooring payable vendors that you may be purchasing from. But you could certainly set up other ledger accounts in your chart and then associate them here. What that will then let you do is later on when you are doing invoice selections for paying and you're doing it by date, one of the things that it will let you then do is choose what's the AP ledger number that you want to select invoices by, rather than trying to do it by individual vendors or only picking certain ledger accounts or vendor invoices from this listing based off of cutoff dates and things like that. You could pick it by the AP ledger, and then that way you could narrow down to just your flooring vendors or just your financial vendors, your utility vendors, your independent contractors, whatever AP ledger number you want to set up and associate with those particular vendor accounts is definitely doable with that function. So another handy little tip there that, again, you may be unaware of. On this same tab, this is where the ledger numbers from the vendor default are going to come from. So here we can see, remember we set this up as a financial vendor, and there is the 634-1 professional services coming from that association. But we could certainly come in here and we could make other selections as well. So for example, let's say that in addition to this being professional services, let's say maybe, for example, I don't know why this would be, but let's say that I also want to be able to pay my telephone bill through there. And as we saw a few moments ago when we were doing the AP expenses, you can make selections on a one-off as you go as well. But by check marking these, that way you'll have that right at the very top of that list when you are doing your AP invoice entry. So another thing to check out with that. A common question I've gotten here on the ordering and return tabs is, why do these even exist? Well, if you need to have different addresses on file for a vendor, such as, let's say, for example, the headquarters address, which you could put here on the name tab. But if you need to send orders to a different address, say, for example, a specific warehouse or a shipping location or anything like that, you can override this address on purchase orders by filling in this order address information here. And this would be what would specifically print on purchase orders to this vendor. So if this is blank, it'll just default to whatever is here on the name tab. But if you have this filled out, this is what would print on purchase orders when you're printing those for the vendor. Likewise, returns. If you are doing a return to a vendor and you need to have those returns shipped elsewhere, this is where you'd be able to plug in that address. Again, if this is blank, it'll default to what's on the name tab. But if you have this filled in, and this is specifically for when you are doing inventory transfers out, and by doing an inventory transfer out underneath modules and inventory, transfer options, and transfer inventory out, typically you'd be transferring these out as a return to vendor. So in the return drop down here, it would be a ship back to vendor. When you do that, to specify the vendor and the vendor address that would print out on the, essentially the slip, you can right click here, change the vendor in the vendor drop down and select that appropriate vendor. And then whatever's on that returns tab is what would print out as basically the shipping vendor on basically the receipt of this activity suitable for folding up and putting in a windowed envelope. Katie is asking, is tab 1 what prints on checks? Yeah, so whatever's on the name tab is what would print on checks. Thank you so much, Katie, for that question. So yeah, whatever you have over here on the name tab, when you are printing checks, this is what would print. The pop-ups area, maybe you're familiar with this, maybe you're not. Most likely you're probably familiar with this from the customer's aspect, but basically whenever you're selecting a vendor, if you want to be immediately reminded of some kind of detail about a vendor, you can put that here on the pop-up tab, and then that will immediately pop up right in the middle of the screen as a reminder of, oh yeah, I need to be making sure that I'm doing something when I'm working with this particular vendor. Last but not least, the FFL tab. And if you're not in the firearms industry, you probably look at this tab and wonder what language we're speaking. But basically, in the firearms industry, the vendors and firearms retailers need to have what's known as a federal firearms license attached to their account. And if you are in selling of firearms and things like that, the idea with this is that you can plug in the vendor FFL information on this tab for those vendors. That will then, by extension, go into the automatic, what's known as the gun book or the bound book. Basically, it's the official report that an agent from the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms is going to be looking for the movement of firearms throughout the country. So by having this FFL on file, that is something that the agent could then reference going back and whenever they need to do some research on the movement of a serialized firearm throughout the country. So that's basically where you can plug that in. You can plug in multiple FFLs per vendor, and then that way when you're receiving it, you could then select the most appropriate FFL based on where that shipment came from. So again, if you're not in the firearms industry, not too big of a deal, but this is something you'll definitely want to take advantage of for your vendors to make use of the automatic electronic bound book. Last but not least, at the very bottom there's a little print label button. And basically the idea with print label is if you would like to very easily spit out a mailing label for a vendor, you can click that button. That will automatically print to whatever barcode label printer you have. I've just got one set up here to kind of look at our just to print on the screen here, and that's probably really small for you, but basically it's saying the name of the vendor and the address and all of that. That's going to be coming from your workstation settings. So back in maintenance, general, and workstations, you can specify the sizing and what barcode label printer you're using on the miscellaneous tab, specifically miscellaneous 3. It's going to use whatever you have here in the address label printer settings. It's going to ask you which barcode printer you want to use, what you want the font size to be, where you want it to start as far as number of inches from the top of the label and the left-hand edge of the label, how much space you want in between the lines, and then how many maximum characters you want per line. And then you can even have that for a specific font name if you'd like. As far as that printer number, you're wondering where that's coming from. That's back on miscellaneous 2, where you can have up to 3 different printers associated with your workstation computer. And as you saw, I was having that reference printer number 1, which we see is just printing to my screen. So that's why you saw it pop up on my screen like that. One thing I didn't mention, and this is going to be good while I'm here in the workstation settings, is you may have noticed that there was a ginormous attach button here. And the idea of attachments is something where you've got, and I don't have one in front of me for suitable, but basically it's got a physical sheet of paper or some kind of document. And let's say you scan that into your computer as a PDF or an image or something like that. Or maybe you even have an actual file that you would like to, for whatever reason, attach to this vendor. You can attach them to the vendor directly by clicking this attach button. You'll notice it'll come up and say you need to set up what's called a storage folder path for the given workstation. So in your workstation settings, let me go and bring that back down here. This is going to be over in the Files tab per workstation. You can come down here and you could specify for, in that example, the vendor attachment storage folder. And then you would just basically point that to wherever you want that to be. I usually would recommend that be right in your AIM folder or AIM-SI folder. That way it's going to be central to all the computers. You can very easily reference it from any computer on your network. I've got one in here set up for vendor attachments. So with that highlighted, I could click select folder and save that so that then when I come back and do that attachment, I'm going to have to close out of that program and go back into it. But just so you can kind of see that in action, when I go back into add or change vendor and go ahead, and we'll just select any given vendor now. But when I click that attach button, it will then bring up this window where I can then drag and drop files into this basically this file space here that will then be easily double clickable from this workstation or any other workstation, as long as all those workstations are referencing the same storage folder path, because it may be a different path from each workstation, but they should all be ultimately pointing to the same location. Then you can double click on that attachment and open it up on that screen, on that computer. And if there are any attachments, that attach button will show in bold-faced text, a bold-faced font. So that way you're going to be immediately aware of, hey, there's an attachment on this vendor. Katie is asking, is that attach button only in version 12? No, that actually does exist in version 11 as well. And you'll see attachments not only here at the vendor area, but also when we are looking at the invoice area. So when you go in and enter an AP invoice, and we'll just say we're doing an invoice for Coast, you will notice that there is going to be an attach button here as well. So by having an attached storage folder path for AP invoices set up, you could then take either, again, a scanned copy of that invoice or just a physical actual PDF or whatever it might be that maybe was emailed to you from the vendor and attach that to the AP invoice for future reference. And in order to see that attachment later on, you would then make sure that you can actually access that in the vendor history. So underneath the vendor history, pulling up that vendor and then going to the invoices tab. Basically, as you highlight invoices here, you would then be able to click that attach button and bring that invoice back up, or whatever other attachments you have in relation to that invoice. And Katie says, okay, well, now my day is made. That is awesome. All right. Thank you so much for attending. Good night. Oh, wait, we have more. Okay. Let's talk a little bit more about some other functions here. Let's go back. I want to mention one other thing, actually, that I now realize that I wanted to talk about while we're in Add Change Vendor. And that's this whole concept of what's known as a payee. So a payee is, in essence, a separate vendor record that is going to be referenced on a first vendor record. So let's say, for example, I have Coast Wholesale here. Maybe I need to send these payments to a completely separate account, somewhere in that maybe it's like a financing account, or maybe it's maybe it's like this is a subsidiary and I need to send it to a headquarters, and maybe the headquarters I will also have set up as a separate vendor. That is the whole idea of this concept of payees. So basically, if that is 0, then when I'm doing invoices, when I'm making payments, it's assuming that the payment is going to that same vendor. But in this payee field, I can hit F6, and what that will do is that will bring my vendor record back up. Let's say that all payments for Coast Wholesale need to be sent to Acme Finances. I could go ahead and I could select that. And now, basically what that will do is I order inventory, or I purchase goods and services from Coast, but the payments need to go to Acme. So that's kind of the idea with payees. And you'll notice throughout the entirety of accounts payable, you'll have the options of browsing or selecting both by vendor and by payee. So I'll go ahead and save that for what it's worth. And then you might notice when we're looking at an AP invoice, and let's go ahead and put one in for Coast, up here at the top, you'll see it's referencing vendor of Coast, but now the payee would be Acme Finances. If I needed to change this on the fly, I could certainly right click and change the payee or reset it to the original if I messed it up and now I need to go back and reset it back to whoever the original payee is, options, things like that. But that way you got that automatically happening for when you need to make sure that you're paying the appropriate vendor account in your system for any given invoices that you're keying in. Let's see, do I have any other things that I want to chat about while I am in Enter AP Invoices? Let's see here. Let's just take a look at this here. I think I've talked about, for the most part, all of this stuff in other webinars that I've done on accounts payable, because this is pretty straightforward stuff here. The invoice itself is just the details of the invoice. The expenses are where you're expensing that to. Let's go ahead and talk a little bit about installments, because maybe you need to do installment payments, or you have the ability to do installment payments on a given vendor invoice. So let's go ahead and do one here. Let's just give it some good old fashioned info here. And let's say that this is a $15,000 expense that I have the ability to pay off over the course of instead of just having to pay it all in one lump sum by June 6th in this case, I can pay this off in over the course of, let's say, 12 months. So what I can do is I can come down here and I can click the installments button. And when I bring up the installments, I can go ahead and I can say that it's going to be paid off over 12 months. The first due date will be 6/6, and I can click create. And what that will do is that will go ahead and set this up with the same invoice number that I gave it, but now it will break it out into sub invoices. So I have sub invoices basically 1 through 12. Each one is $1,250, and each one is basically 1 month apart based on the terms. So that's kind of the idea with that, is I can break that out over the course of 12 months in this case. And if I did have any automatic discounts, I could set those up over here. But we'll talk about that next week, like I said, when we get into doing discounts and things of that nature. So definitely the installments function is something that if you have the ability to break those out into installments so that you're not having to owe all this money at one time, by all means, you can definitely take advantage of that. And if you forgot to set up installments when you were first keying in the AP invoice, you can also go back after the fact, and you can do it using the term dating program found within the accounts payable menu. Basically, it's kind of that same idea. You could go in and select an invoice, and then once you've selected it, you can go to the installments tab, put in the number of installments, the free date, process that, and that will break that out over that X number of payments. So that's an idea there with the term dating function. Obviously, if you've got any notes, you can plug those in on here, and those will be accessible via the vendor history, which will let me segue now into vendor history. Let's go ahead and cancel out of all of this. So some other details that you may not be aware of with vendor history. And it's all about the right clicks, baby, as P. Diddy would say. So what you can do is when you're browsing your vendor history, and this is hopefully fairly straightforward, you probably have used this to come in and just look to see how much you have due upcoming or what the past due amounts are or things like that on this totals tab. On the invoices tab, obviously you can sort by all kinds of invoice activity, but what you may not be aware of is that you can right click on these invoices where you could then break down and look at the ledger expenses that were associated when you invoiced that AP invoice. If you reconciled inventory through the PO reconciliation routine found in AP invoices, you can then view the inventory that was purchased on that invoice. And last but not least, if there were any discount options keyed in for that invoice? And again, we'll talk about that next week. You can view those discounts and whether or not you actually took advantage of them. Kind of the same thing over here on the payments tab. You could see the references for any kind of ACH payments that you made against it or the check information that you made against it. The purchase history. The idea with this is that you can very easily go back and just basically see the amounts that you have had invoiced and paid over the months, and you can see whether or not those amounts are still due with the totals down below. And as you can see down here, these may include payee contracts. So in other words, the payees that are associated with this invoice or with this vendor can also still show here, even though they wouldn't necessarily reflect as a balance on the vendor as far as you owe them money, but that can attach to the invoice amounts that are attached to the payees that are associated with it. Basically, quick reference here for ordering and return activity. Again, you can have that coming from the vendor itself. And then the inventory tab here. The idea with this is basically what you could do is you could quickly bring up inventory associated with this vendor. You can filter on it by location, category, subcategory, and manufacturer. I just did a search here because obviously I don't have a whole heck of a lot of information in this demo system that I have, but basically this lets you find SKUs and items, and it lets you see what the normal price is that you have for these, what your last cost was with this vendor for that item, and when you had last received it as well. So one little extra blurb there for that. Now, I want to talk just a little bit more. Let's kind of wrap up on some payment functions. So I talked about this just a little bit already, but when you are doing invoice selections to pay, assuming you're doing either a check run or otherwise, when you're doing that select invoices by date, there's other options up here apart from just simply going by the cutoff date. You can browse by discount date ranges and things of that nature. You can again select by specific payees or by specific AP ledgers. But basically when you go through and you do this process, you can right click, and that brings up all those invoices here. And basically what the point of this area is just talking about making sure you're right clicking whenever you can, because you may not be aware of right click options that exist from one menu to another. You'll notice that I can select specific items. I don't have any invoices, unfortunately, to kind of do with this, but you can select or unselect highlighted items. You can tag them all. You can change amounts right from here. You can also, from a quick reference standpoint, go back and view the inventory and notes and any discounts that you had associated with that invoice back when you reconciled the invoice with the purchase order or keyed in those notes on that third tab of the notes area, so that way you can see what those were, and then have that all available as I throw my pen around here. Katie is asking, what does the export data from grid do? Actually, Katie, this is actually a universal function any place where you have a grid. It's not directly tied to just this invoices by date area, but basically anything you have on a grid format, you could export, and that will just basically take that data and push it out to an Excel file for you to be able to view. So not much that I could show here, but let me just go ahead and do really quickly, since we are kind of running up to the end of the hour. This is a nice long webinar for you guys. Let me find another screen here where I know I've got some details. Actually, let's just go right back to that setup area for permissions. Let's say for whatever reason you wanted to export this out to Excel. And again, this is basically a grid. And when you right click, you have on every grid the option of exporting that data. So when I export this, I go ahead and save this. Let's just go ahead and save this to the desktop. We'll just leave it what it is. And I'm going to go ahead and open that document up here. And of course, I'm viewing just a clean screen here. So let me go ahead and switch this over to the whole screen here. I'm going to go ahead and double click and open up that Excel spreadsheet that I just exported. And basically it will be whatever was on the grid in Excel format. So that way you can browse through it and do other kinds of things outside of the AIM software. So basically, yeah, you can have that function for browsing anywhere in the system. All right. So let me jump back and we'll kind of wrap up on some of these functions like I was mentioning. In the accounts payable, and after you've selected invoices by date, typically, if you are following the normal process of accounts payable, you would then go and you would print those checks that you have selected to pay. And that would be in the reports area underneath accounts payable, and it would be print checks selected. But you also now have this function where instead of physically printing them, you can print them to what's known as a NACHA file. And again, I know that stands for something off the top of my head here. I don't remember exactly what it stands for, but it does have to do with ACHs. So if you wanted to pay these vendors using the bank account information that you would have on file for them, so again, back in Add Change Vendor, and on any given vendor on the Details tab where you've got their bank account information stored, by printing this to a NACHA file, you can then turn around and through the ACH Treasury software or whatever ACH software you're using, export these datas to ACH Export, and that will push that out. Now, ACH Export here basically is going to, for when you're doing auto pays, the idea with the NACHA file here is that you would just go right into ACH Treasury or whatever program you're using and pull that file in. As far as where that file gets generated, if you do plan on doing this, you want to go and set a specific system variable. So in your system variables underneath maintenance and general maintenance, you're going to want to make sure you set the system variable known as print check selected ACH file name. You can plug in where you want that file to be saved and what you want it to be called, so that when you do the print to NACHA file, it'll basically create that file so that you could then pull that into your treasury program. Or again, whatever ACH program you're using, if your bank happens to provide one. Last but not least, recurring invoices. This is something that I think a lot of people can really take advantage of, and they just aren't doing it because they don't know it exists. Back underneath maintenance and AP, and actually I have it right here, you can set up recurring accounting. The way you set up recurring accounting is you can choose whether you want it to generate AP invoice, or if you would simply like it to only create ledger entries. Because this is an AP and vendor webinar, we're going to say we wanted to create AP invoices. From there, we can give it a description. Let's say it's building rent. We can give it a reference number and a sub number if we so desire. The important things here are going to be when you're first setting these up, what you want the next due date to be. So let's say this is the end of the month, the 31st. This is going to be for whatever company you normally would pay through this. So let's go ahead and select my Acme Finances. We're going to do the same thing for the payee. So we'll go ahead and select Acme Finances again. And then whatever the amount would be, so let's say it's $500. If this is automatically withdrawn from some kind of setup that you have with your institution, you can select the checking account from which it gets drawn. So let's say it's just my checking account number 1. And then the expense date is basically the date that it would show in your ledger, whether you want it to be on the date that you created it, which we'll see in a moment, or whether you want it to be on the due date. I'm going to go ahead and say it's on the due date. From there, we can select the frequency in months and what the due date is each month. So I'm going to say it's on the 31st. If there's an interest rate associated with this, you can plug that in. Last thing would be is set up the expenses. So I'm just going to come over in here and I'm going to find my building rent ledger account. And I'm going to say that's for the full $500. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and save that. So basically with this established, now on that regular basis, I can go in, and knowing this is on the 31st, I can go in on a monthly basis or whenever, and I can go into the ledger module, excuse me, the AP module, and underneath utilities, and I can create recurring accounting entries. So I'm going to go ahead and do this for the month of May, so 5/1 through 5/31. I'm going to hit proceed on that, and any setups that I've done in that recurring area will show up here. So we can see it's going to go ahead and it's going to use actually the next sub number in line. So if you left that sub number blank, this would be sub number 1 initially, then it would be sub 2, sub 3, sub 4. Basically, I'm just going to go ahead and hit save on that. And what that will have done is that will have automatically put into my vendor history. Let's go ahead and pull up Acme Finances. And we'll take a look at the invoice tab, and we will see that that was automatically put in. And because I set it up as auto withdrawal, it's already paid. So basically we can see it was set up and it's done on the 31st. The payment for that came out as of the 31st from my checking account. And we can see if we go ahead and right click and look at the ledger expenses of this invoice, that it went straight into building rent and it came straight out of my checking account. So a nice, quick and easy way of just the things that are really more or less tedious. You're always constantly keying them in. And they're the same thing month in and month out. You can set those up as recurring entries, and then all you have to do is once a month go in and go into utilities and create those recurring accounting entries. And that way you don't have to do them time and time again every single month for those same exact transactions. As always, I want to thank everyone for your attendance and your participation and just your continued support of TriTech so that we can in turn turn around and continue supporting you, because obviously we're what makes America tick. So, and of course, if you're from out of the country, obviously you're probably an important backbone in your community, and you're showing that by making use of the AIM software to track your business and help it grow. If there are any webinar topics you would like me to cover, don't hesitate to email me, training@tritechretail.com. I'm taking all suggestions, and at this point, I'm making them all happen. So whatever we can do to help you out, let us know. If I didn't get a chance to answer your question today, I think I got them all covered here. But if for whatever reason I missed it, or if you think of it afterwards, email me again, training@tritechretail.com. I'll be more than happy to answer them because this is the reason why I do these, is to make sure that you're getting the info you need. 2 more webinars coming up next week. One on why you would want to use delayed deliveries, what they are and how they work. One on doing AP discounts. And then I've set up 2 more webinars for the week afterwards. We're going to be looking at ways of doing inventory price changes and making use of the newly functioning our auto price, expanded in version 12. It does exist in version 11, but we've really taken it to 11 here in version 12. So we'll look at that the following week. That it would be, let's see if I've got a quick calendar here. That would be the week of the 18th. And then I'll also be doing one on doing credit card payments, paying the AP invoices with credit cards. I'll be doing that week as well. So thanks so much, and we will see you next time. Take care, and I hope you make it a great day.